In 2019, after extensive research, I made one of the best decisions I've made in my career and switched from Sony to the fairly new Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. And this is not to say that the Sony a7 III I was leaving was bad. Far from it. It was the camera that really started to help me get better at filming and get through some of my first client work. But switching to the Pocket 4K for the first time forced me to actually buckle down and do a deep dive into learning how to film. Up until this point, I'd coasted somewhat on my creative editing skills to get by, but this camera, being almost fully manual, forces users to really plan their shots and understand all the settings on the camera to get the best result out of it. Needless to say, I had a lot of ups and downs using this camera for the first few months until I really started figuring it out. After doing extensive research on it and testing, I came to realize there wasn't a whole lot of resources online for this camera, and from some of the stuff I started learning from other places, I started creating short video tutorials on specific features and settings on this camera that I thought would be helpful to others learning how to use the camera as well. And since then, this camera has been with me all around the world, from India to remote Alaska to a 5,000-mile competition from Miami to Seattle to underwater towns and countless other adventures. But speaking in a more practical sense, what are some of my thoughts on using this camera after 3 years? And I know that's really the reason you are here, so let's get into this 3-year Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K review. A couple of years ago, I was filming somewhere near the Gulf Coast with a trip that had been planned months in advance with the client. Unfortunately, there was this hurricane coming in. I had to book it to this location before the hurricane got there because we didn't know the next time we'd actually be able to get to this location, depending on how bad that hurricane would be. Needless to say, I had to fly in on one of those tiny little regional jets, and even though the hurricane was hours away, it still affected the wind speed, so it was a very rough flight coming in for a landing. I finally got on the ground and found out that the rental car I had booked wasn't there, and literally everyone else was completely booked because of this hurricane. So I had to take an Uber to the nearest available rental car place 40 miles away, waited 2 hours to get it, and then drove back towards this town that a massive hurricane was coming towards, already late to get there. I got all of my equipment out there and had to film this one thing outside, and had left my Pocket 4K up on a tripod thinking it was fine. Out of nowhere, some 50-mile-per-hour wind gust came and almost made this thing fly through the air and miss all of the grass around it, slamming the Pocket 4K, not in the cage, right down to the pavement, probably from 5 feet up. It was just this small little section of concrete, of course. Bad mistake on my part, obviously. But I got over to it and realized that it actually was totally fine, and it was just had a little cosmetic scratching and otherwise worked fine, and that camera is still working just fine today. On another trip, I mentioned earlier that I drove and filmed a competition from Miami to Seattle. I was on the coast of Washington at Rialto Beach to capture the final shot of this trip and had several Blackmagic cameras kind of all over the beach. And if you know anything about Seattle, the coastline, is that it's almost always raining, and it pretty much was that day. I had some plastic covers I had bought for the cameras, but one of the plastic covers ended up getting ripped in a way that I couldn't really use it well. So trying to come up with something creative, my brilliant idea was to cover up this camera with a beanie in the driving rain. And again, don't do any of this. By the time we had finished filming, the camera was completely soaked, but it had stayed recording the entire time without any issues. But besides that idiotic plan of leaving the camera out in the elements, it worked fine, and of course it's still working today. With these stories, I'm not saying that what I did is recommended or that this camera will always make it through those circumstances, but for me, even when I've been an idiot and done things with the camera you're never supposed to do, it's lived on to film another day over the course of 3 years. And durability and longevity is something with this camera that has been a key component of me continuing to use it on almost every project, because I can generally count on it to work, even if I need to go past the manufacturer's recommendations, which is not advisable. Three years ago, while doing research, I was watching this video of a scuba diver showing off like 3 different cameras underwater and how well they handled the conditions, essentially. And one of them was a Sony a7 III. One of them was, I think, a Lumix GH5 or something to the equivalent of that. And the other was a Pocket 4K. And in the video, it was clear that the Pocket 4K was able to get clearer and less distorted images in this environment than the other cameras. And the difference was palpable. And although it didn't have that, internal image stabilization built into the camera, the footage quality looked great. And this video showing off the image quality is not fully what made me make up my mind to get this camera, but it was a good representation of the quality this camera was capable of and what B-RAW could do. And for me, it's more than the 4K image quality, and it always has been. I've never really cared if the camera could only film in 1920 by 1080. It just needed to perform well in the environments that I worked in every day. And it was honestly just a bonus that it could honestly film in 4K resolution. When I got my hands on the camera, I booked flights for me and another filmmaker friend of mine, and we took this absolutely insane trip over the course of 5 days, puddle jumping all around the country. I really wanted to test this camera out, and during the trip, barely even understanding how to use this camera, let alone how to even wrap my head around dual native ISO, which honestly is an incredible feature to have. That's when I filmed some shots at Bonneville Salt Flats that really got me excited about this camera. Looking back on these shots right here, I do realize to a point that the incredible backdrop had a lot more to do with why the shots look so good. And lighting as well as competition is always more key than any camera you use, obviously. But we also used a Sony a7 III and a Canon camera on this trip, and I just kind of liked how the footage turned out from the Pocket 4K camera. And this really inspired me to really dig into the manual and really learn how to use this camera. And I think it's really exciting to have this level of image quality in a camera that is priced so low, that while you do have to rig it out, it still offers pro-level optics at such a low price. I can't really think of another trip I've taken that showed off how easy and compact you can make this camera than the one I took to Zion National Park. There is this beautiful section of this national park that's called the Narrows that you essentially hike into this narrow canyon, and there with a river running through it. You will definitely get wet hiking in this canyon as you have to cross through the river, float along at sections, and pretty much hike through the river at all times. Me and my friend were filming for a client, getting a bunch of time lapses and stock footage of the canyon and the surrounding national park, and needed to deliver these files as B-RAW. So we had to figure out how to get these cameras into the canyon. And I found a bunch of ways to make compact rig setups with my rigs for the Pocket 4K and even the 6K Pro. And you could check some of those out. We've linked those below and how I do that. I was able to hike through this crazy location with the Pocket 4K already built out in my backpack, ready to go. It's really the size of this camera it's a helpful factor in situations like this. And I know there's been a lot made about the remake of this camera to like a box style cinema camera, but to me, although it does certainly have a strange design and could be cumbersome in some situations, it's actually kind of perfect for run and gun documentary work and remote work like this we did in Zion National Park. And that's a recent story, right? Which brings me to my question of whether or not this camera still has long-term viability. And I've talked extensively about the fact that the age of the camera doesn't matter in other videos I've done. It's really about your skill and experience and actually getting out into the world and filming and trying things and failing that make good videos or films eventually. So I'm not really looking at it from that perspective here. This brings me back to a story from last year where I was armed with this brand new 6K Pro that came out from Blackmagic. I also had just gotten the Ursa G2 and actually had brought 3 Pocket 4Ks with me as I headed out onto the Dalton Highway in Alaska. It is an incredibly remote haul road that goes all the way up to the Arctic Ocean, an insane part of the world, and it's just vast and open and barely anyone is out there. No tourists are crowding around, making it difficult to film. This unique trip offered me a chance to really use the new 6K Pro and see what it was capable of. However, as the trip went on, I found myself actually reaching for that Pocket 4K more often than I did the 6K Pro. Now, was that out of familiarity? It could be, but over the course of the trip, we had more footage from the Pocket 4Ks than any other camera we brought along. And granted, we did have 3 Pocket 4Ks with us, but looking back on it, it's not really why we ended up using them more often. It kind of comes down to the fact that you can actually use MFT lenses and EF lenses with them, which makes it easy to switch between various lenses, and again, making it less bulky than the 6K Pro if you need to use MFT lenses with it. Which, don't get me wrong, the 6K Pro is an excellent camera, but unless I have a need for the 6K footage, I don't really use it as much as the Pocket 4K. Some of that's due to the storage space, and some of that's due to the fact that I can use a wider array of lenses with the Pocket 4K than with the 6K Pro. Something similar happened to me in Olympic National Park a few months ago. I brought a Pocket 4K and a 6K Pro and still reached for that Pocket 4K to film with more than the 6K Pro. And honestly, I think the quality I got out of the shots are still on par with a lot of cameras just entering the market. So for long-term viability, this camera has a long life ahead of it, in my opinion, and has a long life ahead of it as one of my go-to cameras. And this is a little bit strange, probably, of a 3 review on a camera, but I kind of wanted to bring in some story elements and like experiences I've actually had with the camera, because I've done so many videos on the specs and this and that of it. And I've linked some of those below if you want to hear them, but I wanted to really get into my experience with them. Now, for client work, I still use these cameras, but I've found myself using the 6K Pro a lot for a certain style of work that I think you would find interesting. And I explain that here in this video. And it's full of information to be helpful and not fully play into that toxic question of, is it worth it? So check it out.